So that'll introduce our speaker, Mr. Grant Sizemore. So he's originally from Ohio. He grew up fascinated by nature and enjoying the outdoors. He earned degrees in zoology and environmental science from Miami University in Ohio, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, right.
Because then you went to the University of Florida.
Yeah, so. I know, very confusing.
So then you had your MS in Wildlife Ecology and Conservation from the University of Florida. And then prior to joining the American Bird Conservancy, which he's been at for the last 5 years, he worked a lot towards wildlife conservation through policy, outreach, education, and years of wildlife research. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Grant.
Alrighty. So does this advance slides? This
yeah, so just the arrows.
Oh, the arrows that doesn't
not the clicker. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We'll see. Can't stand. So thanks for the introduction. My name is Grant Sizemore. I'm the Director of Invasive Species Programs for American Bird Conservancy. And I'm going to be talking about free-roaming cats through the One Health perspective. So before we get started, just to let you know what we're going to talk about, who is ABC? I think it's important to know, where you're getting your information from. Then we're going to talk a little bit about cats and their impacts on biodiversity worldwide and here in the U.S. Then we'll transition into the zoonotic challenges associated with cats, focusing specifically on 2 diseases, rabies and toxoplasmosis. And then wrap up a little bit with what some of the One Health opportunities might be. So who is American Bird Conservancy? So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in the Plains, Virginia, and DC. We have an office at Van Ness, where I work. We focus on the conservation of native birds and their habitats throughout the Western Hemisphere. So we have a large jurisdiction. And our organization, we do a lot with bird conservation, including reducing habitat loss, degradation. Where I work is in the reducing threats, which is part of our pyramid you can see here, which of course benefits all birds. We focus on halting extinctions. That's where it's most critical, protecting habitats, and then eliminating threats to all of the birds that are at risk. So I work on eliminating threats, and I run our Cats Indoors program, which is part of our Conservation Advocacy Division. So now, cats and biodiversity loss, because cats are not actually helping biodiversity, they are actually contributing to the loss of biodiversity. This map here shows the worldwide distribution of cats. Now, this is a study from 2011, Medina et al., which looked at cats on islands, so you won't see dots on the continents. Rest assured, the cats are all there as well. But you can see that cats are pretty much everywhere. So cats were domesticated about 10,000 years ago from the Near Eastern wildcat, which is in the Middle East area. And since then, they have spread across the globe thanks to people. And wherever they've been spread, they are now a non-native and potentially invasive species. So I say potentially invasive, I guess, as a transition into they are invasive because of the impact that they have in the ecosystems into which they've been introduced. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature lists cats, feral cats in particular, as one of the world's most harmful invasive species globally. They're in the top 100 list by that organization. And the graph that you see is taken from Darty et al. 2016, which was a review of invasive mammalian species across the world and looked at their impacts on species extinctions. And so what you see in this graph is that cats, which is the one on the far left, cats have contributed to the extinction of 63 species worldwide. They are currently impacting about 430 species, and they account for about 26% of all extinctions from invasive species. So they have pretty tremendous impacts on wildlife wherever they are introduced into new ecosystems.
Grant, to clarify that graph.
Sure.
The red bar is the extinction bar, and the gray bars are threatened.
Yeah. So the gray bars are threatened and endangered, okay. And then the red bars, I believe, are extinctions. And the BMR is birds, mammals, and reptiles. So that was a sort of a global view of cat impacts. Now we'll transition into North American impacts. So we'll start with this image on the right. This is taken from the 2014 State of the Birds report, which is put out by the by NASPHV, North American Bird Conservation Initiative. And what you see is that cats are actually, hands down, far and away, the #1 source of human-caused mortality to birds, both in the United States and Canada. It's really not even close. The next closest direct threat is collisions with windows, but we're talking about an order of magnitude difference between those and cats. There was a great study done in 2013, actually 2 studies done in 2013, one looking at Canadian birds, one looking at US birds. Both came to the same conclusion, of course, that cats are the #1 source of direct anthropogenic mortality to birds. But the US study is indicated here on the left with the graph. This is by Loss et al., 2013, and they found that cats kill about 2.4 billion birds every year. That's billion with a B, which is pretty horrifying if you're in bird conservation. But it wasn't just birds that were actually impacted by cats, of course. Also mammals, 12.3 billion small mammals, and an estimated hundreds of millions of reptiles and amphibians. And the data is not really great on reptiles and amphibians, so I take those with a grain of salt. But certainly we know quite a bit about the impacts on birds and mammals, and they are tremendous. So for a lot of people, so I'll take a step back. This is concerning for a lot of reasons, one of which is being that for the bird perspective, which is my organization, we already know that 1/3 of all North American bird species are in heat of urgent conservation action. And of course, the impacts of cats are cumulative with many of the other impacts with building collisions or impacts due to habitat loss and degradation or climate change or whatever. Yeah, lost my train of thought. Okay, doesn't matter. So part of the reason that that cats have such tremendous impacts is and can reach levels like 2.4 billion is because there are so many cats that roam outdoors. And we're talking about well over 100 million cats in the United States alone. So even if each one of those cats consumed just 1 bird each year, that's 100 million birds. Pretty quickly you get to 2.4 billion. It's really not that far-fetched. And I encourage everyone to look at the paper if they're curious. All of it's laid out very clearly. But cats are, of course, instinctive predators. They hunt regardless of whether or not they are hungry. They hunt for fun. If anybody has a cat, I have a cat. You see this predatory behavior whenever you interact with your cat, when you play with your cat, right? You have a laser pointer or a feather toy or a ball of string, sort of the classic toy. And what the cat is doing is it's playing with that toy, which is great. But when they play outside, that behavior actually becomes deadly for wildlife. So when they go and grab that feather toy and maybe claw it and bite at it, suddenly when that happens with a bird outside, that bird's going to die. Whether or not it's killed immediately or dies later as a result of infection, that bird's likely going to die. There was a really good study looking at the impacts of, so many times people say, well, this is just unowned cats, right? And indeed, the Loss et al. Study indicated that 69% of the mortality to birds was a result of feral or unowned cats. But it's owned cats as well that have tremendous impacts on birds. And this study, taken from Lloyd et al. 2014, was called the Kitty Cam study. They put these little cameras on cats' necks and basically just watched and saw what they did. And what they found was that although these cats were owned and had, access to plenty of food in the home, they would go out and they would hunt and they would kill wildlife, which is probably no surprise. But what was surprising, and these are a few of the images taken from the kitty cams during the process, What was surprising was that only 23% of the animals that they killed were returned to the home. And so what that indicated to us was that many of the studies that had relied on prey returns to the home to estimate total impacts by cats were seriously underestimating the total impact of these cats. And of course, cats don't only impact wildlife by directly killing these animals. This study on the right by Bonington et al. From 2013 showed very clearly how a cat in the environment, just being in the environment itself, can lead to impacts on nesting birds. So what they did was they took a model of a stuffed cat, so not even a real cat, and they put it near a nest for, I think it was about 15 minutes, and then they removed it and observed the nest for the next 90 minutes. And what they found was that the parents, they reduced the amount of time, or they reduced the amount of food that they provided to their young by about 1/3. And there was an increased likelihood of nest predation by obviously another predator, not the stuffed cat, but by another predator by an order of magnitude. So just the mere presence of a cat in the environment can have tremendous impacts on the reproductive capacity of nests. Okay, so let's move on. That's some of the predatory impacts of cats in the environment. Now let's talk a little bit about the disease concerns regarding cats. So there are a lot of diseases associated with cats. I'm not going to talk about all of these. I think these are parasites and diseases, but I think they're important to notice that there are quite a few worth additional study. I'm going to focus on two of these today, and they are rabies and toxoplasmosis. By the way, all of these, you probably noticed this is from the CDC. All of these are available on their website. So rabies. This is an image of rabies data taken from 2014. What I think is interesting here is the geographic distribution of rabies among cats in the US. Obviously, rabies isn't a big deal out west, but here in our area, rabies is a big deal, and there are a lot of rabid cats that show up. And so you see a breakdown here of rabies in cats throughout the region. We're looking at DC, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. And so cats are the #1 source of rabies among domestic animals. They are far and away the more likely species to become rabid. And so it used to be dogs, right? Everybody thought of dog, Old Yeller, right? That's what I grew up with thinking about with regard to rabies anyway. Old Yeller, no more, right? It's taken care of. It's cats now. It's Old Tabby, I guess. That'd be an interesting Disney movie. So here in DC, of course, it's 92% of all rabid domestic animals. This is data from 2001 to 2014 have been cats, which is, I think, a pretty sizable proportion. And this graph on the bottom left shows the breakdown among domestic animals. Obviously, there's yearly variation, but consistently cats are pretty high up there. And then we can look at the breakout of other states as well. There's Delaware. Again, cats, that red line. Maryland, cats, the orange line, way above the rest. Pennsylvania. Virginia. And West Virginia has a lot more variation.
Public health officials are looking for people who may have come into contact with a rabid cat. They're worried for your safety. The cat roamed the streets for more than a week, and if you were bitten, it could be deadly. Deanna LeBlanc.
Yeah, Anita and Tom, the health department says this cat was likely rabid from April 10th through April 19th. That means the clock for treatment is ticking because you must be treated within 30 days. Now the health department is aggressively trying to find anyone who may have come into contact with this cat. Pink flyers lining the streets and storefronts in the Compostela Crossing section of Chesapeake carry a serious warning. A rabid cat attacked several people who are now at risk.
The cat was not acting normally. It was attacking people. It was jumping at the window and had a broken leg and was not nursing the broken leg that much.
It jumped right here and bit right here on the side.
Charles Mason says the black and white cat attacked a customer last Monday as he tried to leave Mason's convenience store. His surveillance cameras caught it on video.
He came to the door. As soon as the customer opened the door, it jumped on him, and it either bit him or scratched him because he knocked him off, knocked him down.
That man got treatment, but health officials say the cat roamed near the Family Dollar on Compostela for days, scratching and jumping on several people. Now the health department is trying to find them.
These people are not coming forward because I think that they think the same thing you think, that, oh, once symptoms start, I'll just go to the doctor. Not with this.
If not treated in 30 days, rabies is fatal, and once symptoms start, Engel says it's too late. Now they're going door to door, visiting soup kitchens, even using this electronic sign, hoping to help people before it's too late.
Call us and we will work out transportation. We'll work out whatever we have to do to get them in there for the series of 4. We will work with them. We need them to come in so we don't lose them.
Now, the cat was caught and euthanized last week, but again, it was roaming that area, Compostela and Border Road, between April 10th and April 19th. If you have any questions about this, we're putting it all up for you on wiki.com. In the newsroom, I'm Deanna LeBlanc. 10 on your side.
So this is a video from a local rabies exposure event. Yeah.
Is rabies shots part of the normal cat, for people who have pets? Is that part of the normal things they get for ordinary pet?
Yeah, but some people say, well, my cat never goes outside, I'm not going to get it vaccinated. And I tell them, it doesn't matter. If it bites somebody, then you wish you'd have done it because you got quarantined. Nobody's doing it. All that routine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, we're going to touch on that a little bit here later, but it's good practice to do, but it may not be required by statute. And it probably should be. Anyway, so this is, obviously a bit of a dramatic example of cat rabies and exposure events with people, but I use it to indicate that exposure events do happen as a result of cats. And just because, you're not necessarily afraid of a cat killing you, like you might be of a dog, they can still expose you to rabies and you can die from that. So what does the National Association of State Public Health Veterinarians say about all of this? Well, they're pretty clear when it comes to cats and rabies. All cats need to be vaccinated. Now, whether or not everyone follows that is, of course, another question. And they have a policy statement, which is from 1996, which clearly states that free roaming, unowned, or feral cats need to be removed from the environment, and every cat needs to be vaccinated. Otherwise, the public is at risk. And so what they say for stray animals, stray dogs, cats, and ferrets should be removed from the community, and mechanisms should be put in place to facilitate voluntary surrender of animals to prevent abandonment. Local health departments and animal control officials can enforce the removal of strays more effectively if owned animals are required to have identification and be confined or kept on leash. That's taken from the 2016 Compendium of Animal Rabies Prevention and Control. Okay, so rabies and cat management. We're going to talk a little bit about a study that was published in 2013 by Roebling et al. This is led by some folks from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, looking at the impacts of rabies from the management perspective for cats. And one of the things that they highlighted was there is a disproportionate risk of exposure to people from cats as opposed to wildlife. So far and away, wildlife get rabies more than cats. But you're far less likely to bend over and try and pet a skunk than you are a cat, especially for kids. Which is why I included this photo here. A kid doesn't necessarily recognize the difference between a feral cat and Tigger, who it cuddles up with and goes to sleep with every night. And so kids are one of the populations that are particularly at risk for rabies exposure. as a result of stray cats in particular. There's also a pretty tremendous financial burden associated with these exposure events and just the need to vaccinate cats from the public health standpoint anyway. And here I'm going to turn to my notes because I don't have all of this memorized. But so yeah, about 16% of PEP, so post-exposure prophylaxis, when you get exposed, you get PEP. About 16% of all PEP administration in the U.S. is likely due to cats. And certain locations are actually, estimates are far higher, could be the majority of PEP administration. I know at least one location in Pennsylvania where it is the majority of PEP administration. Of course, PEP is not cheap. I think it's about $2,000 for biologics for prevention. And, you know, when you have mass exposure events, which do happen with stray cats in particular, these financial costs can add up quickly. In 1994, 665 people were exposed to rabies from a single stray kitten in New Hampshire. In 2008, 27 people were exposed to rabies from a single stray kitten at a softball tournament in South Carolina. And in 2011, a girl actually contracted rabies, likely from handling stray cats around her school. She survived, amazingly. I don't know that anybody really knows why, but she did survive. So rabies is 99% fatal, not 100%. So when you're monitoring these cats, you know, you have to send them in for testing when there's an exposure event. And it's about 25,000 cats that are submitted for rabies testing each year. Like I said, that adds up. The New Hampshire event alone, with the 665 people, that cost the locality about $1.1 million as a result of that event. And there are some policy concerns or considerations that must be thought about. So Roebling et al. Stated that requirements for rabies vaccination, requirements or incentives to spay or neuter, and prohibitions against free roaming should be applied to cats as they generally are applied to dogs. And what I think many people will find throughout the United States is that although we do have requirements for dogs when it comes to rabies vaccinations or free roaming or licensing, especially licensing that is tied to rabies vaccinations, you don't see that with cats. Certainly not consistently. Okay, so that's rabies in a nutshell. Now we're going to move on to toxoplasmosis. So just out of curiosity, who here is familiar with toxoplasmosis? Knows anything? All right, that's a good quantity. That's good. The general public, not so much. So this might be a little bit of review for those of you who know anything about toxo for short. So it's caused by a parasitic protozoan, Toxoplasma gondii, a little single-celled organism. And this is the life cycle on the left of this organism. So it relies on felids, so all cats, domestic cats, mountain lions, tigers, whatever, all felids to sexually reproduce. It does so in the feline gut. Once it does so, it is then excreted into the environment through feces. A single cat can excrete hundreds of millions of tiny oocysts into the environment. These oocysts can survive in the environment for years and remain infectious. Then a single oocyst is all it takes to then infect any warm-blooded species that might ingest or inhale that tiny oocyst. Once they ingest or inhale it, it goes into that, what is an intermediate host at this point, reproduces asexually, and basically embeds itself into the tissues of that new host. Then eventually, what this little parasite is hoping for is it will somehow find its way back into a feline, and then it can sexually reproduce again in the feline gut, completing its life cycle. It's a pretty cool little parasite, I gotta admit. The more I learn about it, the more I think it's fascinating. But one of the things I want to point out, again, any warm-blooded species can be a host of Toxoplasma gondii. So that's any bird, any mammal. And one of the things that I really like about this parasite is its ability to manipulate its host. It is a little zombie creating parasite. It's so fascinating. And this is one of the studies that provided greater insight into its ability to manipulate hosts. This is by Berdoy et al. I think it's from 2005, no, 2000. And so what they did was they used rats as an example. They would take a rat, and some were inoculated, or some were given a, I don't know, salt injection or whatever, and then others were actually given toxo. So the infected and uninfected rats were then placed into a small container and given the opportunity to run around that container that had 4 different scents in it. One was a neutral scent. I think it was its own bedding. That was just bedding. One was its own scent, which was bedding from its location, from its home. One was a rabbit scent, and one was cat urine. And so they observed the amount of time spent around those different scents for each of the rats. And what they found was there was no significant difference among the 3 scents here, its own, the neutral, and the rabbit, but there was a very significant difference in the amount of time they would spend near cat urine, depending on their infection status with Toxoplasma gondii. And what we've learned is that, I shouldn't say we, but what researchers have learned, I had no part in this, is that Toxoplasma, when it goes into its intermediate host, it gets into tissues. One of the places it likes to get into is the central nervous system. And then somehow, the mechanism's not really understood yet, but it gets into the brain and somehow adjusts with dopamine levels. But for rats, it creates an attractant to cat urine. So they would inherently or instinctively not want to go near a cat, right? They don't want to die. It's very evolutionarily advantageous to not get eaten by a cat. But when they have this parasite in them, suddenly they're not so worried about that. They become stimulated by the cat urine and want to be near it, thus allowing for the parasite to get back into a feline and complete its life cycle. I think it's truly fascinating. I don't know. Morbid, perhaps, but fascinating. So in the One Health spirit, we're not just going to talk about cats and not just about wildlife. Toxoplasma is one of these things that is widespread, and like I said, any warm-blooded species, which includes domestic animals. And there is a lot of research that has been done in the last 15, 20 years that has been looking at the impacts that toxo has on domestic animals, livestock in particular. Now, some domestic species don't seem to be impacted too much. All of them can host the parasite, of course, and if you were to eat a horse, for example, that had been infected, you could get toxoplasma. But horses do not seem to be susceptible much to clinical toxoplasmosis. But these 3 species here, pigs, goats, and sheep, are particularly susceptible to clinical toxoplasmosis. So in sheep, toxo is one of the causes for abortions and loss of lambs. Preterm lamb loss is what they call it. In goats, it's the same. They can lose their kids, and actually the adults seem to be very susceptible to clinical toxo as well. For pigs, the adults seem to be okay, more or less, but they can lose their young also. And you can see in this graph here, there is a range on the left. There is a range of susceptibility. Pigs, sheep, and goats are kind of at the top, and down below, cattle seem to be pretty resistant to toxo for some reason. But this, of course, has economic implications for a sheep farmer that's trying to raise lambs. If you lose a lot because you got a lot of toxoplasma coming into your ewes, then suddenly you have a big problem. You're going to lose a lot of money. And so there's a lot of information on this. I would encourage you, if you're interested in toxoplasma in domestic animals and livestock, to take a look at it. I posted one of the 20-year reviews by J.P. Dubey. He's also done research on, but he's pretty much the king of toxo. If you ever want to know anything about toxo, he's the guy to go to. And he works for USDA. So toxo in wildlife. There are pretty significant implications for infections in wildlife as well. So I think we'll start with the fact that all warm-blooded species, again, are impacted, and it doesn't necessarily matter your life history characteristics. So whether you're an herbivore, an omnivore, carnivore, whether you're terrestrial, whether you're aquatic, all species seem to be susceptible, and all species are becoming infected increasingly with Toxoplasma gondii. So one of these studies, we'll start with the white-tailed deer, has looked at impacts or infection rates among a species that would normally not really seem to have much interaction with the fecally deposited oocysts by cats, right? They don't interact with cats. They're herbivores, mostly. So they're not going to be acquiring toxoplasma through eating other intermediate hosts, which is one way of getting it, eating the tissue cysts. But a study in northeastern Ohio from just a few years ago found over a 50% infection rate of toxoplasma in white-tailed deer. So what we assume from that is they're getting it from environmental sources, which means oocysts put into the environment from domestic cats. And interestingly enough, the study to back up that hypothesis also looked at the infection rate among cats maintained in colonies. So these would be stray feral cats kept in colonies within the greater Cleveland area is kind of where we're looking. And they found infection rates were just over 50% for 200 cats that they looked at. So that's how an herbivore might get it. That's one example. There are also big concerns with environmental transmission into marine or freshwater environments. So it kind of makes sense that, yes, okay, deer, they might get it in the environment. But because these oocysts last so long and remain infectious for such long periods of time, eventually they make their way downhill, downstream, and into ponds, rivers, lakes, and the ocean. And what we're finding is that some of these species are serving as sentinels and telling us that there's a lot of oocysts from Toxoplasma in the environment. So this graph on the top left is taken from a series of studies that were looking at this gradient of oocyst contamination in the environment and using southern sea otters off the coast of California as that sentinel species. And so what they were finding was that 52% of the 305 dead beach cast otters were testing positive for T. gondii infection, and that 38% of the 257 live otters they tested also had infections with Toxoplasma gondii. So they started to ask, where was this coming from, and began to look into the terrestrial environment and found lots of cats, both domestic and wild. There are mountain lions in that area, but of course there are a whole lot of domestic cats that would feed right into the nearshore waters off the coast of California. And their evaluation of the age-structured infection rates among sea otters indicates that it's likely they're not getting it from being born with it, like the sheep are getting it and then aborting their lambs. They're not getting it through this congenital infection. They're getting it through environmental exposure, because as you get older, the percentage of those age-structured classes that are older are let me rephrase that. Those older classes of sea otters were more likely to be seropositive with Toxoplasma gondii, suggesting, of course, environmental exposure. I should also say that that environmental exposure class structure by age was also observed in deer, also a similar finding suggesting the environmental exposure. Okay, so what about in people? Turns out you don't want toxo for yourself either. So historically, doctors have known about toxo for a while and have advised people, if they're pregnant, to not clean litter boxes, or as recently as, when the AIDS outbreak, I guess, really occurred, they found that those who were immune compromised shouldn't change litter boxes either, or really interact with cats. And for the longest time, that's what doctors believed and told their patients. But new research has shown that you don't just have to be immune compromised, you don't have to just be pregnant, that there are plenty of other great reasons that you don't want to get toxo for yourself. Whether it be an acute infection that you might get immediately or a chronic infection, there are some pretty serious impacts resulting from infection with Toxoplasma. Some of those are listed in the table on the top right, but some are a little less obvious, such as there was a paper study published by Jaroslav Fleger titled "How and Why Toxoplasma Makes Us Crazy." So there are some interesting correlations at this point between Toxoplasma infection and behavioral modifications in people. There was one paper that said road rage was associated with Toxoplasma infection. I'm sure there will be more research on that, but there is a lot of research looking at implications between Toxoplasma infection and mental illness, in particular schizophrenia, also bipolar disorder. But schizophrenia gets a lot of attention. There are some researchers at Johns Hopkins that have been looking at this quite a bit. And again, there's no mechanism really understood, and it's still correlation, not causation at this point, but there's a lot of evidence that's pointing in this direction. And some of the anti-schizophrenia drugs do seem to work on Toxoplasma symptoms, interestingly enough. So some of the groups that are more at risk include young kids who might be playing in sandboxes. So because cats are defecating into the environment and like to defecate in sand, it's thought that sandboxes should just be considered to be infected or contaminated with Toxoplasmosis at this point. So if you have a sandbox in your backyard and you don't keep it covered, don't use it. Just don't use it. Don't let your kids use it. Or at the very least, don't let them use it and then not wash your hands immediately. But that's a pretty tall task to ask for that. So some stats regarding human infections. There are about 1 million new infections in the U.S. Every year. About 500,000 new cases of ocular toxoplasmosis. Sorry, I said 500,000. About 5,000 cases of ocular toxoplasmosis every year. Yeah, you don't want it because you can go blind as a result of ocular toxo. And of course, it has the classic symptoms of hydrocephaly, abortion, that sort of thing. If you get it when you're pregnant, you do not want it when you're pregnant. The good news is, of course, there's no treatment. Once you're infected for life. So what are the pathways of infection for people? We talked a little bit about wildlife and their pathway of infection, which of course can inform how we think people are becoming infected also, and does. But how are people getting infected? So there was a study from 2011 which used a data set from Chicago. It's NCTS. I don't remember what it stands for. I think that's what it's called, NCTS. in CCTS. And it looked at the percentage of women with toxo that got it from oocysts. They were able to detect that and found that 78% of the women who had children born with congenital toxo got it from oocysts, suggesting they got it from environmental contamination, of course. So what we frequently hear, it's sort of this outdated idea, is that really to take care of toxo, all you need to worry about is cooking your meat completely. And certainly you do need to cook your meat to well done, or all the way through to a certain temperature. But that's not the only way you can get toxo. And there are a lot of other good reasons why you should cook your meat anyway. But toxo, you can get it from that source, but you can also get it just from going into the sandbox, or maybe you go into the ocean where some cats have been pooping upstream, or maybe the cat likes to defecate in your garden. Lots of cats do that. And you need to thoroughly wash your fruits and vegetables that come from that garden. So there are a lot of sources of environmental contamination from cats that are really mounting in the amount of evidence that's indicating to researchers that toxo is certainly a foodborne illness, and it's actually the second deadliest foodborne illness in the US, but it continues to be an environmental contaminant as well. And the amount of wildlife that are testing positive for infection with Toxoplasma gondii suggests that there is a lot of fecal contamination with Toxoplasma in the environment. I think it's worth noting that a single cat can produce about 40 grams of feces per day. And I think that adds up to about 76 tons of feces per cat per year, which becomes times 100 million outdoor cats, 7.6 billion tons of feces. That's a lot of poop. I mean, even without the oocysts, you don't want that feces in the environment, right? So, I felt like I should at least mention the One Health philosophy a little bit, since we are talking about One Health. I know everybody here already knows it, but it was worth mentioning what One Health even is. One of the reasons I think that we should take note of the impacts that have been laid out and consider the One Health implications is that the number of cats in the US continues to increase. This is from a study in 2010, which showed that the number of owned cats, this is just owned cats, has tripled in the last 40 years. I mean, it is really increasing. So something needs to be done, because the likelihood, well, at least one study showed that as many as 74% of the cats in that population tested positive for infection with Toxoplasma. And if 74% of them can become positive or host Toxoplasma, and each of them can excrete up to hundreds of millions of oocysts, and each oocyst can last years in the environment, and it only takes one oocyst to become infected, that's a big risk. And so we're going to look at Hawaii as a case study. So any feline, like I said, can host and fecally transmit Toxoplasma gondii oocysts. But in Hawaii, there's only one feline. It's domestic cats. And so Hawaii actually doesn't have any native mammals other than a bat, terrestrial mammals. They have, of course, lots of marine mammals, like that Hawaiian monk seal. So this is an introduced species, and there are many reasons why you do not want to have lots of free-roaming cats. In particular, there are a lot of threatened and endangered species. I mean, Hawaii is the bird extinction capital of the world, so we don't need little introduced predators running around. But from a Toxoplasma standpoint, this is the only species that can transmit it. So if you find Toxoplasma in Hawaii, it's from domestic cats. Turns out, of course, there is toxoplasma in Hawaii, and it has impacts on native species. 8 monk seals have died in recent years as a result of infection from toxoplasma. These are an endangered species. There are about a little over 200 Hawaiian monk seals left in the main Hawaiian Islands. So, you know, losing any one individual is kind of a big deal. And 8 have died from toxoplasma infection. And again, this is another species that would not interact with the cat at all, but this indicates runoff into the marine environment from cat feces inland. Alala, or Hawaiian crow, were extinct in the wild. They have just been reintroduced for, I think this is the 3rd time, but in previous reintroduction efforts, crows were found to be infected quite quickly with toxoplasma, which had negative health impacts for them. Some of them died. I can't say for certain that they died from toxoplasma, but they had toxoplasma infection. And then nene, which is the state bird, the Hawaiian goose, we're finding infections in those birds as well. And this is another omnivore. So like the white-tailed deer, they're not out predating other species where they might have encountered toxoplasma or ingested it that way. They're probably picking it up from the environment where cats have presumably defecated, you know, in and around grass or wherever they might be feeding, and they're ingesting it that way. But for 3 different islands, 21% of nene studied in Kauai were testing positive for infection, 23% on Maui, and 48% on Molokai. That's a pretty high infection rate. And of course, you know, we have to wonder what the impacts will be on the populations of nene as a result of that. Nene are an endangered species. And although it doesn't look like toxo kills them outright, mostly, we also wonder what the impacts are on their behavioral characteristics. A lot of nene die from traumatic events, being hit by cars. And one researcher at least has suggested that toxoplasma might have a role to play in that, because it reduces in people their ability to react quickly and increases risky behavior. So what about toxoplasma in this region? Well, it's here too. There are 2 studies recently that were looking at toxoplasma infections from Virginia, and what they found was that using raccoons as an indicator, this is the Hancock study here, this is from Fairfax County, I'm pretty sure, they found that 84% of 256 raccoons were infected. And the Lilly study found higher than expected shedding rates among cats, the shedding of Toxoplasma oocysts into the environment. Found higher than expected shedding rates among, admittedly a very small sample size, but among cats in Rockbridge County. It was 6% of the 49 cats were actively shedding. Now, that's important because cats don't actively shed forever. They only actively shed for about a 10, 14-day period, and then they generally stop. But they can shed again at later points in their life. If their immune system drops for some reason, or they're re-exposed to toxoplasma from another source, they can then excrete oocysts in the environment multiple times. So once infected, it doesn't mean that they're only going to excrete oocysts for a period of 2 weeks and then be done. And then this graph on the top left looks at some of the regions in the U.S. where toxo has been studied among people and found higher than average rates in Maryland and the eastern U.S. in pregnant women. So the eastern U.S. is not without toxoplasma. So all of these questions, for me, make me wonder, well, dang, that stinks. What are the opportunities? What can we do about it? And it's really about mitigating or minimizing the risk. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is just talk about toxoplasma. Not only because I think it's super fascinating and just won't shut up about my work all the time, but because the public needs to be aware. When I speak to people about toxoplasmosis, I get either A, they've never heard of it, or B, yeah, just don't change cat litter when you're pregnant and you're fine. But there are a lot of other scenarios in which you don't want to get toxo. Really, you don't ever want to get toxo, but because of some of the chronic infections, chronic symptoms as a result of infection, you really do not want to acquire toxo. But there was a recent study just published in the last 6 months or so, which surveyed doctors, medical doctors. This was in Nigeria, so not necessarily representative of the US, but these doctors were surveyed for their general knowledge on the epidemiology of toxoplasma. And what the authors found was a huge gap in the amount of awareness of the life history traits, of the results of infection, some pretty serious stuff as a result or resulting from lack of education, probably in medical school, regarding toxo. Yes?
How is it tested for in humans? Is it a blood test? Or
You can do a blood test, yeah.
is it part of any kind of routine CBC test? Or
Usually with pregnant women, yeah. That's not, I don't think it's routinely screened. There's no routine screening.
That actually takes me to my next point.
Okay, good.
We need to do routine screening. It is tested for in some other countries, routinely with pregnant women, not in the U.S. There are a few states that do it in the Northeast that routinely screen, but toxo is not even a reportable disease. So you could find a whole bunch of people with it, and you don't necessarily need to report it. And people aren't looking for toxoplasmosis because they're not really aware of the symptoms or two, the prevalence and life history traits that might allow you to acquire toxo to begin with. So we need to do public awareness and professional awareness among all the different One Health organizations, domestic animals, wildlife, and public health, yeah, and humans, and also actually try to acquire some data and do routine screening on pregnant women, but also on other at-risk populations like those who are immune compromised. And then eventually take it to everyone, I would say, because of the chronic impacts that toxo can have. And then third, there's just a huge need to keep cats contained. They're the main vector for this pathogen. They are the definitive host. There are other felines in the U.S. that can, of course, excrete oocysts into the environment, but there are so many more domestic cats, and you're far more likely to have those domestic cats excreting in areas where people are frequenting. There are a lot of other great reasons to keep cats contained. That's my cat there, and she's on a leash outside. So if you need to give your cat some outdoor time, there are some opportunities to do that in a safe and controlled way, safe for your cat, safe for wildlife. A leash is one example. A catio is another example, a cat patio, which is enclosed. It's sort of this up and coming thing. And just keeping cats happy and healthy inside, give them a little play, some stimulation, feed them plenty of litter boxes, depending on the number of cats you have. But there are so many great reasons to keep cats contained. Toxoplasmosis, rabies, cat predation, these are just a few of them. And that's pretty much it. That's cats from the One Health perspective. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. If you want, this is our website, abcbirds.org. Then you can go to the Cats Indoors program, or it's abcbirds.org/cats. And a lot of our information will be there, or you can email me at that email address. So thank you.
Y'all's opinion of the trap spaying and release stuff. I had to deal with this in Afghanistan in the Army, and there was a couple of Army vets that were promoting this, and they were, the soldiers could rent a cat, they were lonely and all this crap, and said, you know, that's against general order number 1. You're not supposed to have contact with any indigenous animals, you know, domestic, feral, or wildlife, and you're increasing the risk of, especially in Afghanistan, rabies, the dogs, the leishmaniasis and everything. And I fought tooth and nail with some knuckleheads, and we were seeing Tungiasis. People would adopt cats in their barracks, and they would rotate out. They'd leave the cat, and then the fleas got hungry, and so they would attack the next person that moved in their barracks.
Yeah.
This endless public health threat, and they were spending $4,000 a piece to adopt one and get falsified papers and ship them back to the United States. And I said, you know, I told the commanders, like, stop this now. We got enough feral animals in the United States. You don't need to bring ones with new diseases from damn Afghanistan. We had rabid cats. We had a soldier get rabies from a dog because he was hiding a bunch of stray dogs that he was keeping. They all got in a fight. He got bitten and he failed to report it, so he didn't get post-exposure. And, you know, it's just like, come on, guys, you're here to fight the Taliban, not to raise goddamn cats. It's just absurd. But it's an endless thing because people think in those environments, those animals are just like the ones that they had at home. You know, they're screened for disease. I said, here, the people aren't screened for disease. Are you nuts? You know, this is like the mothership for zoonotic diseases. And you know, just trying to preach that to the soldiers and their commanders is just endless. Part of it is CDC and USDA allowing people to bring adopted feral animals from, you know, a lot of these high-risk parts of the world into the United States with just a quote health certificate.
So the trap, neuter, release management strategy, our organization 100% opposes that strategy.
My theory is, if you can trap one, you can put your hands on it to spay and neuter, you can euthanize it. Clear and simple. You know, come on.
So, according to the law, once you take ownership of an animal, you cannot abandon it. That would be illegal. So I would say that trap, neuter, release actually is illegal because it violates anti-abandonment laws. And I think basically every state has an anti-abandonment law for domestic animals. There's also been a fair bit of research looking at trap, neuter, release programs to see if they actually reduce feral cat populations, and they suggest that they don't work, essentially. You need to get about 74 to 91%, I think are the numbers, just to keep the population steady, not to decrease it. So it's highly impractical. It's far more efficient to just remove the animals from the environment.
We had an issue. We had a rabies advisory board in Afghanistan with all the host nation, Afghan, and then all the NATO forces, their medical teams. We had a universal. So if there was an exposure, you know, everybody was aware of it. And there was a woman at the U.S. Embassy that had a metal, you know, shipping container that she got adapted for around 70 feral cats, and they had like cat doors on it. It was like a cat colony type thing, and the U.S. taxpayers were paying because the embassy supported this because it gave people something to do because they were under stress and all this crap, you know. And so we had a meeting, the rabies advisory board meeting, and there was a big battle between the veterinarians that favored the trap, spay, neuter, release. And finally, one guy stood up and he said, "This is crap." He said, "I'm the Army vet that has to manage this colony because it's on the embassy property." And he said the population is growing because feral cats are attracted to other cats, whether they've been spayed or not. And also because, guess what? The fat cats that are in the colony are eating food, and the feral cats figure that out pretty quick. And so he said to maintain that approximately 70 cats, he said, I was still having to euthanize about 30 a month because in Kabul, Afghanistan, they ain't a hell of a lot to eat for cats. And so, you know, it was absurd.
Yeah.
And it's a bogus theory that people have promoted, and it does not work, especially in an austere environment like that. And in San Francisco, when I was living there, they had cat colonies on some of the estuaries and everything, and all of them were diseased. The death rate was high. And it wasn't rabies, it was the respiratory diseases and toxo and all this stuff. And it's like, come on, folks, you're contaminating your environment, and you're not doing anything to help the animals.
Yeah. So in addition to the population is not reducing under TNR, so-called management, those cats are being put back into the environment where they continue to kill wildlife, and they get fed, which some might say that's good. Then they don't kill animals. Of course, there's a lot of research that says that's not true at all.
They get
but
fat and still kill animals.
Right, and they're healthier, and they're not. They get higher densities because then it increases the carrying capacity of the area, and it increases the likelihood of interaction between cats and, say, raccoons or foxes or whatever. So you get these density dependent responses and increases the likelihood for disease transmission.
I'm interested in this sort of psychology of how you sell this, because I was reading an article the other day about people who consider themselves very, very environmentally conscious, and they drive Prius and eat kale, and they recycle. But when it comes to pets, they have no concern with the environment at all. They don't pick up their dog droppings. They feed them, food that uses huge amounts of animal products, and that people are, even though they consider themselves to be environmentalists, when it comes to pets, they're kind of blind. So, and of course right now it's, pets are such an in thing. I wonder how you're marketing this or how you're selling it.
Maybe these people have toxo.
It could be.
I'd like to know what their titers are.
Yeah, that is suggested a lot. I try not to say it's related to the crazy cat lady mentality, because there's no evidence to suggest that, but it's an interesting hypothesis. How do we?
They do exist.
Oh, okay, well, yeah.
Having been in private practice, they exist.
I don't think we know the answer to that question yet. We sell it. I don't want to say sell it. I mean, we provide the appropriate evidence to the target audience that we might be talking to. So if we're talking to medical doctors, we'll talk about rabies and toxo and human health implications. We're talking to, you get the idea. But for pet owners in particular, it's a challenge. They don't necessarily think, it's like telling someone how to be with their kid. They don't necessarily think rationally or logically, and don't look beyond the impacts to their individual pet. So it's, so what if my cat kills a bunch of birds and small mammals in my backyard? He enjoys it. What's the harm? Well, the harm is, when 100 million cats are doing that, you get population reductions of wildlife. So I don't know the answer. There's been research that shows that people aren't responding to the cold, hard data regarding wildlife impacts. We know that.
I can tell you that.
Yeah, I'm sure But so I think it probably will come down to a selfish, persuasive argument that is, your cat's going to live a lot longer and healthier life if you keep it contained. It's not going to be at risk of being killed by a dog or attacked by another cat or run over by a car or drinking, antifreeze, or whatever the case may be. I think if you can make that case, it probably works the best, but it can also be a very big challenge to bring a cat in that's been used to being outside its whole life. It can be done for sure, but it requires an owner to be patient and dedicated, and not all owners are willing to do that, to bring a cat indoors that's been out. So it might have to be for the next cat that they own, they agree to keep it indoors or provided outdoor access, but in a restrained way. And so that's one of the things that we advocate, is basically treating cats like dogs in statute. So we would like to see permanent identification of cats, so that if they become lost, then they can actually be reunited with their owners. Microchips would be my preferred way to do that. Mandatory spay neuter unless you want to breed your cat, and that's fine, but you should get a permit to do that. Leash laws so that your cat doesn't free roam. It's bad for the cat, it's bad for wildlife. It's not that great for your neighbors who don't want to have their gardens peed and pooped on by the neighbor's cat. There's just a lot of great reasons to keep cats contained. So that's the way I would go about it. We're not always the most welcome spokesperson for that because we're a conservation organization. They just assume we're only interested in saving wildlife. But I have a cat, right? I like to think I'm doing right by her to keep her indoors.
How do you detoxify the oocysts?
So you can kill them if you freeze them to a certain temperature. You can kill them. You can heat them, of course, if you're heating meat. That's another. Of course, those are tissue cysts, bradyzoites.
Is there any practical way that if you're trying to, collect your pet's waste inside, that you can actually?
So they don't. So the oocysts are excreted and they don't sporulate or become infectious for a few days. So if you're cleaning the litter box regularly, you're probably not at risk. And when I say regularly, it's like every day, every other day.
But then it gets thrown out and goes for landfill.
Right.
They sporulate there.
Yeah.
Well, so is there any practical way of destroying them before you put the little baggie in the recycle or the garbage or whatever?
You can freeze them, I guess.
Put them in the freezer.
No,
it has to be really cold.
Yeah. That's a good question. I've never been asked that before. I guess I never thought about anybody taking their cat litter trash and trying to
It's a great new market.
decontaminate it.
Contaminated before.
Right. No, that's a good question.
Otherwise, you're only halfway.
Cat litter sterilized.
True. Yeah. So there are some of the studies that look at the longevity of these oocysts even put them in like a vat of hydrochloric acid, and they were still infectious for a certain period of time. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily doing that. I guess freezing it is probably the best way, but I'd have to refer to the literature to refresh my memory on how long and what temperature.
They don't. You obviously can't suffocate them in a plastic bag.
No. Yeah.
Another disease, I don't know if you've encountered this, but when I was in practice in New Mexico, clearly half of the abscesses I had on cats in the summertime were bubonic plague.
Yeah. So I don't generally, we don't talk about it so much in the eastern U.S. because plague's not really out here. But yeah, in the western U.S., whenever I speak with people there, plague, we bring it up and continue to get, instances of human transmission from cats.
There's usually a veterinarian every year or two that dies of that. Not consistently, but periodically read where usually Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, a private practitioner got infected from a cat and went undiagnosed.
There was something in this week's New England Journal, a child getting cowpox from a pet cat. And had a 2 centimeter necrotic lesion on her cheek that cleared once she was treated appropriately. So.
Does anybody know anything about the connection between Bordetella cats and the HPV vaccine?
I don't.
I've been reading about it because somebody said, one of my friends said that, their daughter ended up getting like a fibromyalgia, and then she ended up, she has, so she was a cheerleader and she was and at 13 she gets the vaccine, and then when she started doing the research, and I did look it up, there is some research out there that, young, adolescent, females that are getting these vaccines that show positive for Bordetella are also showing positive for, signs of fibromyalgia and other neurologic symptoms. Bordetella's it's another bacterium and that is predominant in cats, right? Bordetella hensley.
Yeah, we talk about a lot more in dogs, but there's a Bordetella species that's in cats too.
Bartonella hensley is.
Yeah, Bartonella.
Bartonella. I said Bordetella. Bartonella. That's what it was. Bartonella. But I was like, that was, and I didn't know if that was, starting to make the rounds. But CDC actually does have a paper out on it.
No, I haven't seen that.
South America that had toxo and sarcoidosis, people tend to eat meat very rare, raw.
Yeah, so certain populations around the world are more likely to be seropositive as a result of their dietary practice. Like I think France is crazy, the number of people that probably have toxo because they eat so much raw meat. But the U.S., raw meat's not a big part of the diet, raw mammalian meat anyway. So I suspect that would be a much lower source of transmission than it would be in other parts of the world.
You can track it better in France because medicine is socialized there. So yeah, you can. I'm sure your screening is.
They do screening for toxo. Yeah.
All right, I'm gonna thank Grant.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your time and
Sure.
everything coming down here. Our tradition here at Untitled Chapter is we always give our speakers a flag that's been thrown over the Capitol.
Oh, cool.
So
Oh,
there you go.
thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah, appreciate it.
And this will be posted as a webinar, so One Health Commission sponsors the webinar account, so we'll get it up there for you as well. We'll distribute with the email list as well. We'll email out everybody with that contact information, so yes, keep the connections of the small group that was here tonight. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Will.
You.
Thanks for